Hello and welcome to the Car Keynote Reviews channel, and welcome to the Genesis GV60. Very interesting electric car from Genesis. And in today's video, we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood. We're going to take a look underneath it, take a look at the outside, inside, some things we like, some things we do not like, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. And usually it's a little interesting when we say electric car and under the hood because you expect a big storage area. And this one does have the storage area. It's not very big. What I call the sandwich warmer, because underneath it there's a lot of hot stuff. Let's talk about them. So electric car recipe is very simple. There is an electric motor with an inverter. That inverter sends power to it, takes power from it when it regenerates, and there's a massive battery underneath this car. We'll look at it in a little bit when we look underneath it, but that is a simple recipe, but that sounds way too simple for electric cars. What makes or breaks electric cars, at least in my humble opinion, is the thermal management system. Because remember, in electric cars, you don't have an engine. So you don't have a heat generator. There's no combustion. There's none of that stuff. So the thermal management system's life revolves around one basic thing. How do you heat the battery and how do you cool the battery without becoming counterproductive and kind of killing the range in the process? This is how this system works. So we have two cooling systems. One of them is dedicated to the motors. It basically has a little cooler on the motor. Oil comes out, gets cooled by the coolant, and that coolant has an electric water pump and a radiator, and it just circulates, and life is great. Then there is a second cooling system, which is for the battery, and that's really the big deal right there. That cooling system cools the battery, warms it up as well, and it has its own water pump, its own radiator as well. And here's how these systems kind of integrate and work together. Let's start with the motor one. Very simple. It goes to the motors. It kind of exchanges heat with the oil, comes back, but there's an interesting part. They pass through a heat exchanger between those two systems, and this is where they exchange heat when things get too cold and they need to kind of take every last bit of heat to keep things warmed up. But what is interesting is the battery cooling system. Let's dive into it a little bit more. So when the battery is too cold, we need to warm it up. And the way this happens is coolant starts scavenging heat from anywhere it can and goes to the battery or warms it up. But when things are way too cold and we really need to heat up this battery rapidly, actually a PTC heater, an electric heater, comes on and warms up the coolant, which then warms up the battery. Not the most efficient system in the world, because having a heater is counterproductive. It draws a lot of power, and that really lowers your range in cold weather. It's not the worst system out there, but it's definitely not the top. Now, what about when the battery is too hot? And this is usually the norm. Eventually, even in cold weather, eventually the battery will warm up. Well, coolant will cool the battery, cycle back, water pump sends it to the radiator, cools it down, then the cycle continues. But when things get way too hot, there is a battery chiller, which is basically a heat exchanger, small heat exchanger, where refrigerant from the HVAC system goes to it and helps cool that coolant, which then cools the battery. Very simple, and that's probably the best way to do it. And speaking of HVAC systems, let's talk about that system, because that's actually very important. Because equally on how do you cool and warm the battery, how do you cool and warm the cabin? So this car has actually a heat pump system. In a very few seconds, in a very inaccurate way, because it's a lot more complicated than it is. AC systems in cars have been the same for a very long time. Cold side part inside that cools the cabin, hot side outside that expels, refrigerant runs in between, and life is good. Well, the heat pump system has the ability to flip that, make the hot side inside, cold side outside, to generate heat into the cabin. Now, this heat pump system is pretty robust, pretty interesting. It actually works pretty well up to a certain temperature, and then it becomes very inefficient and starts really hurting the range, because they put a PTC heater for the cabin. That heater will only come on when things are really cold, and you really need to help that system until things warm up, and then we're better. They do take a lot longer to warm up because we don't have a gasoline engine, but they eventually will. Now the heat pump system, an interesting thing about it is when you want to heat the cabin, it will send hot gas into a separate condenser inside the car, and then when you want to cool the cabin, it still has an evaporator and things kind of go in. So basically inside the cabin you have two things. You have the condenser for the heat, you have the evaporator for the cool. It's not the same one that gets switched. They're actually two separate units, and then the PCC heater sits in front of it. Now this system, for its cooling system, it does have two three-way valves. It's not the most sophisticated thing in the world, because when you have these two separate systems and two three-way valves and all the plumbing in between them, it gets things a little busy, and that's why you don't have a lot of storage space here in the front, because it needs to make space for all that real estate, which there's a lot of it. A lot of hoses, a lot of crossing in between them, and it's a little bit on the complex side if you ask me, compared to something like a Tesla's Octovalve, which is probably what makes Tesla work to begin with. Now the GV60 in its performance model does have something very clever called ELSD. So it's an electronic limited slip differential, but it's actually not electronic as in the electric motor does something. No, it is electronically controlled, which is pretty cool. So in the final drive, they have a hydraulic pump that utilizes the fluid that cools the motor to apply a multi-plate clutch to do the limited slip differential. That is very sophisticated for a car like this. And when I say a car like this, let's talk about some of the cool things here. 0-60 in this car, in this very innocent looking car, is 3.6 seconds. And this has a boost mode and steering wheel, which really gets you to that point. It is very fast, and it's very scary, because you look at it, it just has a very humble and loving face. Let's put it this way, it's a nice people's car. You don't expect it to be this fast. 3.6 seconds 0-60 is plenty fast, folks. This car might put some serious performance cars to shame because of how fast it takes off. But that comes at a huge cost, money-wise. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But then range. The range in this model advertised right around 235 miles, although in our testing we only got 196 and right around 30-40 degrees Fahrenheit. But you can get another model of this exact car with rear-wheel drive only that goes up to 294, which is better, could be better than that, but that is actually a lot better. Looking around here and kind of behind the scenes, my only concern is there's a lot of hoses and a lot of real estate here, and that's where I feel like Hyundai or Genesis could really work on compacting things with a kind of a 2.0 version of their electric cars, because things that are a little on the busy side underneath here compared to other electric cars. Let's take a look underneath the GV60. Now, this is an electric car. Everything is covered up front to back, something to be expected. Let's take a look at the front suspension here, which is kind of interesting. So the lower control arms are actually split into two. You have two arms, they're both aluminum, and two ball joints at the bottom. Usually you'll see that in like performance cars, and I guess they were trying to go with that. But if you look at the top, it's actually a McPherson strut with an aluminum knuckle, just typical McPherson strut. However, if you come around and look on this side, you see this little actuator right here. This is actually a continuously variable damper, which is a pretty cool thing. It continuously varies the force of the strut, which is pretty cool. It's not like one setting, it's continuously variable, and that is pretty cool. Everything here is aluminum except the strut, of course, including the backing plate. That is pretty interesting there. And then you look at the brakes, this massive, it looks to me like a Brembo caliper, although it doesn't have any identification on it. It's a massive brakes for this performance model here. This, of course, being a giant performance brakes, they do squeal a lot, especially when it's moist out and you back out first thing in the morning. It's gonna squeal a lot. This is a characteristic of brakes like that. In case you get a car like this or you're considering it, that is something you're gonna have to contend with, because there's no way around it. These are high performance brakes, and they're going to do that. Moving around the back, the battery actually starts from here and goes all the way back. It's pretty typical with electric cars. I do like that the edges are well covered. You notice this cover wraps around all the way in the front, and that is something pretty good. I really like it. And what I do like about this car is, see, electric cars are usually strange to lift and really they have weird lift points. This one just has a regular pinch weld. You do lift it from there. It's pretty simple, nothing really special or different about it. We really welcome that. As we walk our way to the back, everything is also covered up in the back. This is where you have the rear motor and the inverter on top of it. I love that it's just one continuous cover. You do have an opening here. If you come around, you can see the edge of the battery, some of the high voltage covering. Now the battery cover is really heavy duty and it seems like it's really well made, and that we really welcome. Let's look at the rear suspension here. So you have kind of a mix of aluminum and steel. Some of the arms are aluminum, some of them are steel. You do have also a shock that is adjustable, the motor of it right here. Same thing, continuously variable. And then we look at the rear axle. This is giant, big axle, because of course it's an electric car that is extremely fast, this particular one. Single piston caliper in the back, which is also a pretty large caliper. Usually you'll have cars with front brakes that are like that. This one, the rear brakes is this size, with an electronic parking brake actuator that's built in, which is pretty cool. We like that. And I love how everything is covered up. However, they do have to follow the trend. Small. You do have this giant opening here. I wish they would have just covered it up a little bit better. That would have been nice, but I suppose we can live with that. And of course, this being an electric car, you don't have exhaust tips or anything. Let's take a look at the outside of the GV60. One thing I have to be said about this thing, it does look good. It just looks, it has like a striking look that really catches your eye. It doesn't look like any other car. One thing I will say here, the slash design, the two lines that Genesis is kind of establishing their image with, really blends in nicely here. It doesn't feel blocky. They kind of managed to, if you look at their other cars, they're always blocky, but here they managed to integrate this into kind of a swoopy design. It really looks pretty nice. This particular color is a pretty interesting color. You do have the Genesis logo right here at the top. This, even though it's an electric car, doesn't have a completely closed up front. Slightly closed up here, but then it does have, although it's mostly closed with a little bit opening, but it does resemble a normal car grille. And normal is something you're going to see with this car a lot. Now, something interesting here about the safety system. The safety system in this car is pretty sophisticated. It has a radar sensor right here. It's pretty low to the ground, but it also has one here and one on the other side and two more in the back bumper. It's a pretty sophisticated driver assistance system. Actually, it works really good. Now, for some reason, this is gray. It's not really, it's kind of meant to resemble a dark chrome, but it's not. And then that same color kind of carries along. I guess with this particular car, it does work, but it's just an interesting thought about it. Something cool here, the hood is kind of most of the fender, because the fender is just this little piece, and then the rest of it is a hood. So when it's open, it's like this giant thing. It's a pretty interesting design. Few cars in this time has a similar design. We look at the side. I like that they didn't do a lot. They didn't go overboard. You do have a little bit at the bottom, but most of the door is actually flat. They don't have strange body lines or whatnot. It gives it kind of a very interesting look. Now, the door handles are this pop-up door handles. They are actually mechanical door handles. They are not electronic, not a button. This is actually a physical button. But what pops it out is something electric. When you lock the doors, they'll lock and they'll disappear. And then when you unlock the door or you kind of approach the car, these will pop up. I suppose it works for aerodynamic to make things flat. But then you look at this. This is a face recognition camera. So you can program your face. So when you come here, you look at it, it'll recognize your face and it'll open the doors. That is pretty interesting to see. Usually cars that have another form of entry, it's never worked in the past, like a button, and it's just, but this is kind of a new take on that. Face recognition. Interesting. Moving back to here, I really like this line. It's just very flamboyant line that goes like that. Gives it a pretty interesting profile. It's pretty cool. This whole car just really looks interesting. Then you notice this is kind of curved and bubbled up. If you look at it from this angle, you can clearly see the bubble up. Gives it a very cool profile. Of course, here we have a little compliance flap. If you don't know what that is, we've talked about it in multiple videos. So tires that stick out from cars in the US, certain amount, they have to be contained in the body, and because this tire sticks out too much, they put this to make it compliant. That's what the compliance flap means. Then we look at the back. I think the back looks very cool. It's again, this is like a bubbly design, but they integrated these two lines in it. It just looks very, very right. I really like it. I think it's a very good looking car. You have this little spoiler here with a huge brake light. And I like that they did not get carried away with their badging. You just have Genesis and then GV60. That's it. We don't need all-wheel drive performance, electric, all this jazz. We don't have any of that. And then the interesting thing here is the charge port. So usually Genesis have been putting their charge port in the front of the car, which we really like. This one doesn't. This one actually has it right here. It is a nice charge port. The door itself is okay. It's not the sturdiest in the world, but it's not the flimsiest either. We're seeing a lot of flimsier car. So this car, of course, have fast charging. You do have only a cover for that, not for this. And interestingly enough, this shows you like the general level of charge. And this button, you press it, it closes the door. But did you know that this actually presses the same button? If you look all the way up here, you do have a little button that all it does is just press this to open the door. That is actually pretty interesting. Let's look at the back here. There is absolutely no bumper. If anything, the bumper is kind of in and the back door is sticking out further. That is something we're seeing with a lot of new cars. I mean, the problem with this is you back into anything small, you already damage the back door. That's the only downside of it. It does look pretty cool. Let's look at the back area here. Of course, power operated tailgate here with the motors integrated into the shocks themselves, which is pretty much how the automotive industry is going. Decent space initially when you look at it. The only problem is because of this swoopy design, you really don't have a lot of height. This is as high as you can go before the door hits. It's a decent space. I love these lights. They're LED lights, really illuminate everything here. Something you don't see in a lot of cars, even luxury ones. I like these aluminum pieces, and this one that comes down, it just gives it a feeling of quality. What I like most, and we'll talk about the inside a lot more with this, this very nice material extends all the way here. It's the same thing with the headliner and everything. I really like that. I think this is a pretty cool thing. Now you do have some storage here, not a lot though. The reason for that is, remember, you have an electric motor with the inverter on top of it, so it takes quite a bit of space. You do have a charging cable, you have the inflate kit, whatnot. It's an okay space, but it could be larger. And another thing that is pretty cool, in case your car is completely dead and you need to charge it and you cannot open the charge port, they do give you a little bit of a safety door here, and then there's a pull that manually opens that door. I suppose that is pretty nice to have, and I like that they didn't. Usually manufacturers just leave a little cord hanging. They didn't do that. They gave you something a little bit nicer, which is nice. Now the back door does have button to close the door and button to close the door and lock the car, which is something you're seeing a lot in newer cars, especially this one being a luxury car. That is a very important thing. Let's take a look at the interior of the GV60, where I think here is where things truly shine. I mean, just look at this interior. It is such a nice place to be in, and their execution here is very good. I mean, the materials are beautiful. Every surface you touch, it just feels very, very nice. I mean, the leather here is super soft. You have this really nice kind of design on the seats, the diamond design, and then the steering wheel leather is very few luxury cars actually have this nice leather on the steering wheel. And then the headliner is this really nice weight, and it continues on the A-pillar. It just, they did this really properly. And then we dive into the little details. The infotainment screen. While it is outdated, doesn't have wireless Apple CarPlay, it works. It's good. I wish it was the latest infotainment system from Hyundai Genesis, but it's not. You do have a rotary dial. It is a touch screen as well, so I suppose that is good. You look at the gauge. It's a giant screen. Usually I'm against giant screens, but this one actually displays the map all the time, and that is a really useful feature. You do have some customizations, whatnot. So I suppose this screen is good because it is really featureful. Then we look at the center area right here. I love this kind of floating center console. You have all this opening. It just gives it a feeling of roominess. The HVAC controls, though, they're all physical. They have their own dedicated little screen with extra stuff, so you don't have to go on the infotainment screen to operate. I really like that. Makes everything physical. And that's one of the hallmarks of this car. This is an electric car. Usually electric cars, you get it. You need to get a master's degree to operate them because they're completely strange than any other normal car. This feels like a normal car. Push button start. Shifter is right here. We're going to get to the shifter in a second. All physical controls. Everything is very normal. And that's how it always should be. People don't have to spend a significant amount of time to learn how to operate it, on top of the lifestyle change to own an electric car. Then we talk about the shifter, which is a little strange. Initially you look at it, this is this little nice kind of crystal, looks really nice, except as soon as you start the car it rolls and disappears. It's a very nice gimmick the first time you see it, but then 2 minutes later you realize, wait, this looks super nice, but I can never see it unless the car is off and I'm not in it. So what was the point? And then I just my mechanic mind kicks in. What happens when this breaks and it doesn't want to turn and you're just staring at it? Well, how do we shift into drive? That is, yeah, nothing is perfect in life, but I think this is a little bit of an unnecessary gimmick. And then you may notice this car has paddle shifters. It's an electric car. It doesn't even have a transmission, so why do we have paddle shifters? Well, actually, Hyundai and Genesis, they use these for how much regenerative braking you want, up to I-pedal mode, which is single pedal driving. This is a really good idea, and I-pedal mode works really good. It brings the car to complete halt. It does have a little bit of a learning curve, but once you're used to it, it actually works really, really good, and I really like it. But folks, I cannot get past how nice this interior is. Everything about it. The fit and finish is excellent. The materials are beautiful. It's such a beautiful place to be in, but at the same time, it is functional. You do have a lot of storage. You have this kind of floating center console. You have an area underneath it. I think this is where they really did this car super, super well. Let's take a look at the back seat of the GV60. I'm 5'7". This is my driving position. I have plenty of knee room, decent headroom. Even though this has the fixed glass roof, doesn't open or anything, it's just a fixed glass, but still, this is pretty spacious. But there is something a little strange going on here in the back of the GV60. Now, let's reiterate one thing. This is a small car. It's pretty spacious, doesn't have the transmission hump, it's pretty flat floor, so it's pretty comfortable in the back. But I would not take this as a chauffeur-driven car at all. Yet we have seat controls here. You can move the seat back and forth, so that is signs of a chauffeur-driven car. You do have some lighting here, you have an extra vent here, you even have a manual shade. I don't know what they were going here with, but I feel like this doesn't exactly fit this car for a chauffeur-driven car. I guess it could work, but not exactly the car I would call chauffeur-driven car. Moving past that, you do have a really nice vent here, right in front. And I love how the Alcantara comes almost all the way to the floor. It just leaves a little bit of section. The only thing is the seat. So everything is very nice leather, except this very hard, cheap old plastic. At least they would have done this. At least, I understand plastic, you know, and try and save cost. This could have been a little nicer, especially since this is a chauffeur-driven car. That's not a good idea, folks. That's the truth have to be said. This was kind of strange to see in this car. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Genesis GV60 Performance all-wheel drive. First thing is the range and the charging situation. I feel like the range is not the greatest in the electric car world, especially at this caliber and this how nice this car is otherwise. So here's what we had in our testing. Previously, we've tested an Ioniq 5, which was super impressive that it charges from right around 20% to 80% in 18 minutes. That's actually very impressive. And we've tested it, actually did it exactly 18 minutes. This one, however, charging it from around 20% to 80% took 31 minutes, and then reaching all the way to 100 took an additional 23 minutes, grand total of 54 minutes to go from 20% to 100%, and a very fast charger. And the problem is, at weather around 30-40 degrees, we only got 196 miles of range. That is not the greatest range in the planet. Now, I understand it's a performance car and it's blistering fast, and I have to say that. But that comes at a hefty cost of the price of this car. It looks nice on the outside. It is super nice on the inside. But that price is really going to stand in the way, because at $71,000, there is a lot of really, really nice SUVs, even from Genesis, that cost the same or sometimes less. And that is going to be a hard one for the GV60. So should you buy a Genesis GV60? Folks, this one is a tough one, because this particular car, from a material standpoint, especially the inside, the material standpoint, the fit finish, the outside look, it's really good. But there is a small problem. This particular performance model wouldn't actually be my first pick, might not even be my last. And here's a few things. In my mind, one of the competitors for this car, not direct competitors, but close, is a Tesla Model Y. Now, in the looks department and in the interior department, this will make the Model Y look like a cheap eco box, with the exception of the infotainment screen of the Tesla, which is on a class of its own and unrivaled, in my opinion. But here's the problem, though. This is a very nice interior, extremely nice interior, but that wears off after a while. And when you compare this head-to-head with the Model Y, well, the Model Y is bigger, it's more practical because it is bigger, and in the performance model, it is similar performance, if not a little better. It's very slightly better. And then the range is a little bit more, and the biggest problem is this costs a lot more than the Model Y, close to $20,000 more for a car that is very nice, but it is smaller and not as efficient. That's the problem. I really like this car. When you sit inside this car, it is just proper luxury. It doesn't feel like some spaceship from the future. Doesn't take you more than a minute to operate it. Does have its quirks. It's not perfect, of course, but the price is the problem. This, after all, is a small car that cost, as tested right here in the performance model, make sure you see there, $71,000 or there on about. That is a lot of money. I mean, that puts you deep into some seriously good luxury SUVs, full-size SUVs, let alone a small car like this. I feel like a gasoline model of this car at close to half that price would fly off the showroom floors. But don't we have the Ioniq and the Kona for that? Good question. This is the problem for the prestigious GV60. Simply too expensive and not as good in the electric car department as some of its competitors, which cost a lot less. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.